Alright, bio cleaners, so you may have watched the video already about how to replace your pressure line, or fix, I should say, your pressure line that's inside the casing if it blows or something. But how about your chemical lines? What if you have a leak inside? What can you do? So we're going to talk a little bit about that and how you can basically address that nasty issue. So I'm going to have our camera person kind of zoom in a little bit. One of the most common places you're going to get a leak is where you have a union. I just have this as an example. So this obviously isn't what your hose looks like inside. But wherever you have a union inside your hose, if you have replaced the pressure line at some point, or chemical line I should say at some point, this is prime if it ever gets run over by a vehicle. What happens is this connection will get sandwiched. There's a little barb fitting in there, which we'll take a look at in a little bit. And between that and then you've got these little pinch clamps which clamp the chemical line onto the barb. Those pinch clamps could also be damaged. And you will end up with a leak inside, which stinks because, as you know, you're running a vacuum in the gun and it's always going to take the path of least resistance. So in other words, if you're able to draw air in your hose, since that's a short distance going to your gun, it's not going to draw your chemical because air is much easier to draw, and so you're going to all of a sudden start sucking air. The chemical that's in your truck or your trailer, whatever the case may be, is then going to start draining inside your hose. So you're going to be wasting valuable liquid gold essentially. So you don't want that to happen either. But how can you find it if you have one of these connections that's damaged? How can you find that inside the hose? You've got 100, maybe 150 feet of hose to work with. What can you do? So we're going to talk about a little shortcut that we can make that will help us actually identify where that leak is, and then we'll talk about fixing it. So stay tuned. So a real easy way to diagnose where that leak might be is we're going to make a little tool, and we'll show a nicer picture of that. Basically, we're going to take the same valve that we use for the rinse valve on the gun. We're going to take a quick disconnect coupling for our air check, and then the same fitting that we use on the gun, which is 1/4 inch thread on one end and then the barb fitting. We're going to use those three pieces and make a little quick tool that we can use to diagnose where that leak might be. So let's take a look at that picture now. All right, so we've got our cool tool made. Hopefully that was pretty easy for you. And now we're going to hook it to our air chuck. Let's go ahead and do that. So now that's all attached, our valve is closed. And now we're going to go through the testing phase. So we've got somewhere mysteriously a leak in our chemical lines, one or both. So what we do is we take the suspected chemical line off, we attach that to our valve, like so, and then we very slowly crack this valve, just so a little bit of air actually goes out. That air is going to travel through the hose, and it's going to take the path of least resistance. So once it finds the imperfection in there, it's going to actually come out at that location instead of pushing that air all the way back to our tank, our chemical tank. When it does push its way out, because we have a lot of surfactant in our soap and our pre-wash, it's going to do what? It's going to foam up. So all of a sudden, as it's pushing it back, we find that spot, we're going to see a buildup of foam inside our hose casing. And it's at that buildup of foam where our leak is. And that's probably going to be one of those unions that about 90% of the time is that. The other time is the casing for some reason has gotten a worn spot on it, and so then it's been allowed to actually wear one of the chemical lines hole through it. But more often than not, it's going to be one of those unions that's worn out. And so that works really well when we're at our shop and we've got access to air. But what do we do when we don't have access to air? We're on the truck, we're maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours away from our shop. How do we fix the hose then? How do we identify where that leak is? Well, that's another little trick that I've done too. So let's take a look at that one next. So, We saw what it looked like when we tried to find it inside our shop, but now we're on the truck and we need to finish this job. What are we going to do to maybe identify that leak, get it fixed so we can get back to washing again? So this is a trick that I've used. Instead of having air, I do have access to water. So what I do is I take that same barbed fitting and I take the tip out of my partner's gun, wash gun, and I screw that barbed fitting into his wash gun. Obviously I can't do it on my gun because that chemical line isn't long enough to reach the end of the gun, but my partner's, my helper's gun is. So I take that, I thread that on there, and I take that chemical line that we suspect is the leak, I connect it to it, and now what do we do? Well, we go back to the trigger, and this is what we do not do. We do not hold it down, because as you might imagine, that's either 5 or even 8 gallons a minute running through that gun. That chemical line can't handle that. So two things are going to happen. Either the first one, it's going to blow the end off, and unfortunately I've also made that mistake because it also makes the chemical line swell up. Then it blows the end off, and then as you might imagine, it blows it right back at you. Or you might rupture the chemical line, which I have not had happen, but I have gotten sprayed by my own stupidity before. So learn from my mistakes. But what we do is we just barely feather the trigger, just a little bit, release. You'll see the water come out. It'll start to push the chemical back again, but now we're dealing with water, and so it's not going to suds quite as freely as it did when we had air back at the shop, but it will still suds, and it will always take the path of least resistance. So, if at all possible, either you or your partner, since you're using his gun, inspect your hose as you're performing this little trick, this troubleshooting trick, and see where that leak is throughout the hose. Once it's identified, then you can use your crimping tools, your barbed fittings that you hopefully have with you, and your pinch clamps, and make that repair real quickly. And we have another video for that, so watch that if you don't really know or can't remember how to make that connection between the chemical line splits. So.